So next, we're going to hear from Doug Baandow, who's a senior fellow at the Cato Institute. And he's going to speak to us today for about 20 minutes as well, regarding a few areas, including the United States relationship with the Russia-Ukraine crisis, the role of the United States in the crisis and economic sanctions, the expected role of the United States during the coming period in dealing with the situation, and the relationship of the U.S. with regional and international actors, and the impact of that on the development of the crisis as well. So, Doug, please go ahead.
I'm glad to be participating on this panel. I wish it was under better circumstances. The issue we're dealing with is an extraordinarily serious one, both from a security and a humanitarian standpoint. And then add to that the economic ramifications. We have something which we can call a crisis, in contrast to many of the issues that come up where it doesn't really apply. We have a large-scale conventional war that is going on. It involves a nuclear power, and that is very significant. And there are going to be important implications and consequences from this conflict that go all over the world. And my guess is we're going to be dealing with the impact of this conflict for many years. I mean, the U.S. role immediately, of course, is having been the most important country negotiating with Vladimir Putin in recent months over the future of security issues, where after he built up his forces around Ukraine, and is now the most important country involved in terms of providing aid to Ukraine and also trying to guarantee the security of Europe. But the issues go back a long way. You know, a principle of geopolitics is that great powers want to have spheres of influence. And in many ways, I think that is the fundamental issue we are dealing with. You know, American policymakers act like they don't, but of course they do. The US considers the Western Hemisphere its sphere of influence. It's called the Monroe Doctrine. And the US has played very rough with countries in its region when they did not do what it wanted. And the really famous incident with the Soviet Union was the Cuban Missile Crisis back in 1962, where the Soviets were putting military forces, both conventional weapons as well as nuclear weapons, into Cuba. And the two countries almost went to war, where the US was determined to force them out. So the United States has gone through this as well. The Russian Empire had a sphere of influence in Eastern Europe. The Soviet Union certainly did with the Warsaw Pact members and its willingness to intervene militarily, intervened in East Germany, Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary. And it is this sphere of influence that Russia lost with the collapse of the Soviet Union. And in many ways, what we see today is a continuing process of dealing with that. It was very difficult for Russia. It was difficult for the Russian people to have been in what was a great power and then find themselves in a country that was much diminished. And the United States and Europeans made a lot of promises and a lot of assurances that NATO would not move up to the Russian border. And we know that's the case. We have a lot of declassified documents in Washington as well as other capitals. And this is something where the United States and the Europeans did not live up to, that ultimately decided to expand NATO despite the fact the Russians were not happy about it. The Baltic states, the border is within 100 miles of St. Petersburg. And when you look at Ukraine, you can understand why the Russians would not want an alliance against them with forces in Ukraine. But that wasn't all. The US and the Europeans, NATO, through its influence around in other ways, basically went to war with Serbia and dismantled it and had no interest in what Russia thought. And this was at a time where, again, Russia was in great decline under Boris Yeltsin. There was very little that it could do. There were what were called color revolutions in both the Ukraine and Georgia, which helped put in power governments that were rather hostile to Russia. In 2014, we saw the overthrow of an elected president who was pro-Russian. A fairly complicated set of circumstances there, but in many ways, this person was forced from power by street protesters backed by the United States. The US had officials on the streets of Kyiv talking about who they wanted to take over, and Russia looked at this and saw this as threatening. And over the last 8 years, my guess is that Russia has kind of looked at a steady US and allied support for Ukraine, talking about Ukraine coming into NATO, etc. And it kind of reached a boiling point. Now, it's not the only issue, and people point out, I mean, things are very complex, and trying to understand the motivations of somebody like Vladimir Putin is also complex. He certainly wanted a stronger Russia. He talked about the tragedy of the Soviet Union falling apart. He had a view of Ukraine as an integral part of Russia, with, of course, Russia dominant and not Ukraine dominant. But it's important to recognize that he hasn't really acted on those. He's been in power 22 years. The one theme we heard throughout his time in power was NATO expansion. He gave a famous speech in 2007 at the Munich Security Conference. He talked about that. He complained about the US throwing its military power around. He complained about the many wars the US was fighting. This came after Iraq, for example, and Afghanistan. So I think that all of those things came together in his mind. Now, we've seen from the fall into February with the buildup of Russian forces, an attempt at negotiation. As far as we can tell, the US denied his essential request that NATO not expand to Ukraine. And the US, Europeans, NATO were all still saying they'd bring Ukraine in. This is one of the ironies, and I think it had another harmful impact, which is, in fact, no one in Europe and no one in NATO wanted to bring Ukraine in because none of them wanted to defend it. But they all told Ukraine that they were going to bring it in. So Ukraine had expectations of being protected by the West, when in fact the West had no intention at all of doing so, but it continued to say that it would, and that's what the Russians heard. The question, why did things happen today? At this moment, it's hard to know. I suspect that Putin was frustrated. I think he may have thought it was a good time with a new administration in Washington that seemed weak. It also might have been his own kind of age and desire for legacy. He's 70 years old. He may have looked at this as he wanted to make Ukraine part of Russia, or at least subservient to Russia. So someday maybe we'll see the archives, we'll find out the decision process, but it appears to have been one man. From what we know, the foreign minister Lavrov didn't know that Russia was attacking until the night before. This was not a decision that was widely shared. That was not a decision where a lot of people had input. Of course, for whatever reason it occurred today, we're stuck dealing with what is a very serious crisis. I mean, most important, we have a war and all of the consequences of war. It could easily expand. The Allies are providing weapons over the border. The Russians could strike at those weapons. Russian missiles could end up even inadvertently in Polish or other NATO territory. There's talk of flying in planes to support the Ukrainians. All of these things have potential for spreading that war. There are a lot of proposals for even more direct involvement, talking about humanitarian consequences as well. 2 or 3 million refugees have already fled Ukraine, horrendous humanitarian consequences. And of course, if you think about the rest of the world, there are economic impacts, and there's also this kind of taking all the attention away from other very real problems. And one can imagine that if you were a Yemeni citizen, you might say, why all this attention to Ukraine? I've been suffering for 8 years. Hundreds of thousands of Yemenis have died either from military action or starvation, disease, and other causes. Why don't we see this attention for Yemen? Why don't we see it for Libya or Syria or elsewhere? So this is taking away much of the world's attention to one conflict that's very serious, but taking it away from others. Now, the question of the role of sanctions, and certainly America's role, sanctions have become, for the United States at least, what it does if it has nothing else to do. Especially the US Congress, I think, is made up of people who would like to be the Secretary of State, and their view is something must be done. If they're not willing to go to war, which usually they aren't, thank goodness, sanctions seem like the easy thing to do. We'll simply put some economic penalties on. Now, in theory, this is supposed to have an impact on other countries to change their decision-making. It rarely does. The Trump administration used maximum pressure, as it called it, on North Korea, on Iran, on Venezuela, on Syria, has a lot of sanctions actually for 60 years on Cuba. There were sanctions on Russia as well as some on China, had no impact on behavior. So, this has been a regular policy of the United States. It's one that has grown over the years. It's increasingly been matched by the Europeans, where they have also started their own sanction policies. In 2014, sanctions were placed on Russia after the annexation of Crimea, and then the involvement in the Donbass and the conflict there. And those have all been expanded. And the purpose of sanctions in the case today first was to threaten the Russians in the hopes that it would prevent Putin from acting. And then once he acted, they were placed on really to punish him. And I think some people may have thought putting them on would cause him to change policy, but for the most part, I believe it was a decision to punish Russia and an attempt to weaken it economically. The problem is in the short term, it doesn't matter much. He has the military he has. Sanctions won't change that. And it will primarily hurt the Russian people who don't have a lot to say about their government, as opposed to Putin himself. So what's different this time is that usually sanctions are more limited, and the US has found it difficult to negotiate with the Europeans on what to sanction. This time public pressure pushed sanctions forward very dramatically. And I think this is a unique aspect we've never seen in other sanctions cases. So we saw a very large role for sanctions of affecting financial markets, the SWIFT system, banks, energy, high-tech imports, across the board, an attempt to weaken. The US has actually cut off essentially all trade with Russia. And you've seen that supplemented by boycotts, where companies are simply leaving of their own accord, people not buying Western or Russian products and drinks and other sorts of things. It's clearly going to have a major impact on the standard of living of the Russian people. The problem is, in a system like this, as long as Putin retains control, and he has really increased repression. I mean, he's significantly increased the role of the police state, basically eliminated any independent media sources. You can't even refer to this as a war. These things, he's doing his best to hold on to power and make it impossible for the people to do anything about it, even if they feel pain from the economic sanctions and oppose the war. I think the critical questions for the US and Europeans in particular going forward is how to use sanctions to encourage a peaceful settlement. This conflict needs to end. There needs to be a ceasefire in negotiations. I would like to see the US and Europeans tell Russia that with a ceasefire, they hold sanctions in abeyance, they stop weapons transfers if the Russians are willing to stop the fight and try to reach a settlement. There have been some negotiations. There's at least a little hope there, though no one knows how serious they are. But sanctions should be used in a way that tries to promote the end of the conflict. And the second is, when the war ends, the question is, will the West be willing to get rid of all of them? There will be a temptation, I think, to try to punish Russia, at least if Putin is still in power. But the world will not gain if what Russia turns into is, in essence, a very large North Korea with many more nuclear weapons. An isolated country, impoverished, angry, but very well armed, is probably not going to be a very positive player in the international system. Now, the question of America's role upcoming, I think the US has been the driving force on issues here in dealing with the issues. So the question is going to be, number one, militarily. The US is involved in NATO, has promised to defend all the NATO countries. A question of how to make sure that the conflict remains contained to the Ukraine. The question of what kind of military aid to provide to the Ukrainians as long as they're fighting. And then there have been a lot of proposals for the US to intervene. And intervention could be very dangerous. I mean, the problem here is that, the moment you intervene militarily, you're a legitimate target. And if the Russians decide to start shooting at NATO countries, NATO is very likely to shoot back. And one could find a war that expands. And what is very dangerous in this case is Russia has nuclear weapons. And Russian military doctrine is to use tactical nuclear weapons to essentially cover up the fact that it has a weaker conventional force than the United States. And we've seen that weakness on the ground so far. Russia has not done as well as many people expected. So any conflict could, go up the scale to nuclear. And once it starts up that chain, it suddenly becomes very, very dangerous. So I think this is something that has to be taken into account. And part of this is going to be the role of the Europeans. They, of course, are closer. They are much more vulnerable. The question of how they see it, how they want the US, and how they themselves want to be involved militarily. As for sanctions, again, the US is the dominant power when it comes to sanctions, but in this case, the Europeans are playing a very important role. For the most part, the sanctions are pushed by the US and Europe. Countries like India, China, throughout the Middle East are not willing to follow these sanctions. So this is kind of decisions are going to have to be made where the US and Europeans will have to be willing to back away. And that's one where at least one could imagine other countries being able to give some guidance and encouragement to the US and Europeans for finding the right moment to move back on sanctions. Finally, the question here is diplomatically, is the US and the Europeans have to work very hard to promote an end to the war. That the focus today needs to be on how to stop this. The hope before was to prevent it from happening. Today, we've got to find a way to stop it. The longer it goes on, the harder it will be to settle. The more antagonism there will be, the more casualties, the more death, the more both sides will hate each other. This is a crisis that needs to be ended soon rather than later. We've seen conflicts that go on for a very long time that are very damaging to both sides. Finally, I was asked about the role of the United States with other regional and international actors. Obviously, the relationship with Ukraine is the most important. The question of is supporting it and trying to help it find a settlement. NATO, the US is the dominant player there, but we've seen a lot of NATO countries recognizing they need to do more for their own security. So the US should be pushing that and finding ways to help them move forward so European security becomes more European. What we see is Europe and the European Union could concentrate on economic issues, foreign aid, development, humanitarian assistance. All of these are going to be important for years, even once the war is over. The rebuilding process in Ukraine is going to be extraordinarily difficult and expensive. Europeans can take the lead on that. And the US should work with other countries. The US has had conversations with China, which has a close relationship with Russia. We see much the same with Israel and Turkey. All of them can encourage Moscow to look for a way out of this. The US should encourage them to do so. I think Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates also could. They've had a good relationship with Russia as well. What we want is to have other countries encouraging Russia to find a way to settle this in a way that they achieve their most important security goals, but end the war. And then we see the US very busy trying to find new oil sources. It's a little embarrassing actually for the US, but it's gone to Venezuela. It's trying to finalize the JCPOA with Iran, which in my view is a positive for other reasons, but it would also bring more oil back onto the market. The US has gone to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and UAE as well. And then the US should look for other international organizations to get involved, the United Nations, the OSCE, anyone that it can find to be involved in monitoring, in mediating, overseeing, promoting peacekeeping. All of these are potential ways to find a settlement that might have a role. We need to engage anyone out there who might be a step away from the US to have at least some sense of objectivity, not just an American actor, not just a European actor, that Russia would be willing to trust as well as Ukraine. So what we have today is an extraordinary challenge, and we need to meet it. I think the US and the Europeans, given the geography, are taking the lead, but as I mentioned, other countries can play a very important role here. And then I believe it's important that we move on to other humanitarian crises. If one looks at the Middle East, there are an awful lot of people suffering in Yemen, in Syria, in Libya, countries like that. These are countries that need attention to find ways to bring peace, to bring development, to end conflict. And the Western world, if it finds an answer to Ukraine, needs to move on and not just quit, and recognize the role, especially of the United States, in starting those conflicts and being involved. That we need to find a way to end them as well. So there's a lot out there for the international community to handle, and I look forward to the questions and the discussion to come. Thank you.